Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. In the last video, we discussed the reversible and irreversible cell injuries in much detail. In this video, we'll be discussing one of the forms of cell death named necrosis. So let's dive into the lecture. Okay, so in the previous lecture, we discussed that irreversible cell injury always leads to the cell death. Okay, so we have got so many forms of cell death. One of those forms is the necrosis. So what is necrosis? Necrosis is a form of cell death in which cellular membrane falls apart and cellular enzymes leak out and ultimately digest the cell. Okay, so this was the definition of necrosis. So there must be mechanism behind it as well. So let's discuss about the mechanism. Okay, so consider this is a cell and this is the nucleus. Okay, having chromatin material. Okay, we discussed in the cell injury that due to the reduced oxygen supply to the tissue, the ATP formation was also reduced. Due to this reduced ATP synthesis, the cellular permeability was increasing, which causes the influx of water alongside sodium. Okay, so due to this influx, there will be the damage to cell membrane. Alongside the damage to cell membrane, there will be the damage to the lysosomal membrane as well. Okay, so this lysosomal membrane gets damaged, which causes the release of its hydrolytic enzymes outside. Okay, so these hydrolytic enzymes then causes the proteolysis of this cell and its content, thereby causes the necrosis. So this was the mechanism of necrosis. So it much pretty simpler in this case. Now let's discuss about the patterns of necrosis. Okay, so we have got two patterns of necrosis primarily. So let's discuss them one by one. In the first pattern, there will be the denaturation of cellular protein, which includes both structural as well as enzymatic protein. Okay, so there will be the denaturation of structural as well as enzymatic protein. Okay, so due to which the cellular architecture is preserved. Due to which cellular architecture is preserved, you must ask why the cellular architecture is preserved in this case. We know that in this case, the enzymatic protein is also getting denatured, and these enzymatic proteins are mainly involved in the process of proteolysis. So there won't be the function of these enzymatic proteins, so there won't be any proteolysis of cell. That's why the cellular architecture will be preserved in this case. Okay, so this point must be clear to you. Preserved cellular architecture. Okay, so this pattern of necrosis is known as coagulative necrosis. Okay, so this pattern of necrosis is known as coagulative necrosis. And the affected tissue in this necrosis would be hard and white in color. So you must remember this point in your mind. And affected tissue would be hard and white in color mostly. So now let's talk about the second pattern of necrosis. Okay, so in this pattern there will be the dissolution of cellular protein. Okay, so this pattern of necrosis mostly occur at the foci of infection. We know that infection always elicits the immune responses. Okay, so due to which there will be the aggregation of immune cell at the site of infection, and these immune cells, which includes both macrophages and neutrophils, releases certain hydrolytic enzymes, and these hydrolytic enzymes then after causes the dissolution of cellular proteins. Okay, so that's why in this case the cellular architecture is not preserved, and there will be the loss of cellular framework in this case. So you must remember this point in your mind. So there will be the dissolution of cellular protein, due to which cellular architecture is lost. So this pattern of necrosis, especially known as liquefactive necrosis. So this pattern of necrosis is known as liquefactive necrosis. Okay, so now let's talk where this coagulative necrosis occur and where does this liquefactive. Okay, so coagulative necrosis mostly occur due to the infarction of solid organs. Okay, so due to the ischemic infarction of solid organs except for brain. Okay, it mostly occur in the ischemic infarction of solid organs except for brain. Okay, so the best example of this pattern of necrosis is myocardial infarction. Okay, so in this myocardial infarction, the blood supply to the part of myocardial cells or myocardium is cut off, due to which there will be the formation of coagulative necrotic patches. Okay, so you must remember this point in your mind. So the best example is myocardial infarction. This pattern of necrosis could also occur in the spleen or kidney. Okay, so this is the part of affected kidney which has undergone the coagulative necrosis, and you can see the necrotic patch which is hard in this case and white in color. And you must also remember that the affected part of that tissue would be wedge shaped. This point should be clear cut to you. Okay, so this was all about the examples and site of coagulative necrosis. Now let's talk about the liquefactive necrosis. So liquefactive necrosis mostly occur in the brain. Okay, the best example of liquefactive necrosis is brain abscesses. So in the brain abscesses, there will be the infection of part of brain tissue. Due to the infection, there will be the aggregation of immune cells, which includes neutrophils and macrophages, and these neutrophils then releases hydrolytic enzymes, causes the dissolution of brain protein, and therefore causes the formation of fluid filled cavities in the brain. Okay, so this was all about the examples and site of liquefactive necrosis. Best example is brain abscesses, in which the dissolution is caused by neutrophil. Okay, so let's look onto the diagram of brain abscesses or liquefactive necrosis occurring in the brain tissue. Okay, so this is the picture, this is the diagram. In this diagram you can clearly see there is the cutoff of blood supply to the particular part of brain. Okay, so due to which there is the formation of liquefactive necrotic patches in this case, and these liquefactive necrotic patches would be fluid filled cavities in this case. Okay, so this was all about the coagulative and liquefactive necrosis. Now we must remember one extra point, that the necrosis would always be pathological, so there won't be any physiological necrosis. Okay, so you must clearly remember this point. Now we have got special patterns or types of necrosis as well, so let's discuss them one by one. So firstly, we have got caseous necrosis. Okay, so caseous necrosis mostly occur at the foci of tuberculous infection. Okay, so on the gross examination, it appears to be cheese-like, hence named caseous. Okay, so it will also be yellow in color. So let's write it down. Caseous necrosis mostly occurs at the foci of tuberculous infection, okay, appears to be cheese-like, yellow in color, so hence named caseous. So you must also remember that caseous necrosis is the combination of coagulative as well as liquefactive necrosis. Okay, so it's the combination. Unlike the coagulative necrosis, in this case the tissue architecture is lost. Okay, so this was the combination of coagulative as well as liquefactive, and this pattern of necrosis, this special type of necrosis, is mostly the characteristic of granulomatous inflammation. Okay, so just remember it for time being. We'll discuss it in much detail in the topic of chronic inflammation. Right now, just remember it. Characteristic of granulomatous matous inflammation. So due to the granulomatous inflammation, there will be the macrophages surrounding these necrotic patches. Okay, so these macrophages surrounds these necrotic patches. Okay, so this was all about the caseous necrosis. Okay, so let's learn it through the diagram. This is the diagram of caseous necrosis. You can clearly see the cheese-like appearance in this diagram, which is yellow in color. It can occur anywhere in the body, but mostly in the lung tissues or tissue which have been infected by the tuberculous infection. Now let's talk about the gangrene. So gangrene is not a distinctive form of cell death. It is the condition of the lower limb which has lost its blood supply and has undergone the coagulative necrosis. If the bacterial infection is superimposed, then the morphological appearance changes to the liquefactive necrosis. The this coagulative part is equivalent to the dry gangrene in this case, in which the tissue architecture is preserved, and the liquefactive part in this case is equivalent to the wet gangrene, where the tissue architecture is lost. So we have got dry gangrene. So gangrene mostly occur in the lower limbs than upper limbs. It could occur in the upper limbs, but mostly in the lower limbs. Dry gangrene equivalent to the coagulative. Okay, so if the bacterial infection is superimposed in this region, then this coagulative necrosis changes to the liquefactive form, which is known as wet gangrene in this case. Equivalent to the liquefactive. Okay, so now let's talk about the fat necrosis, the third special form of necrosis named fat necrosis. Fat necrosis is of two types. It could be enzymatic as well as traumatic. Okay, so traumatic fat necrosis mostly occur in the breast or thigh injury. You can clearly visualize it in the bruises. Okay, so due to the bruises, there will be the formation of fat necrosis, which is traumatic in nature. Now let's talk about the enzymatic in much detail. Enzymatic. The best example of enzymatic fat necrosis is the acute pancreatitis. Okay, so in acute pancreatitis, what happens that there will be the inflammation of pancreas. Due to the inflammation, there will be the release of certain enzymes by pancreatic cells. So these enzymes, one of those enzymes is the lipase. This lipase causes the digestion of lipids, therefore causes the release of fatty acid. These fatty acids then combines with the calcium, causes the formation of chalky white appearance. Okay, so you can clearly visualize it in this diagram. There is the chalky white appearance in this case. Okay, and the phenomena involved is known as saponification. So the best example of it is acute pancreatitis. What's happening in this acute pancreatitis? There will be the release of lipase. This lipase causes the digestion of lipids, causes the release of fatty acids. These fatty acid combines with the calcium and chalky white appearance is seen. Chalky white appearance is seen on gross examination. On microscopic examination, there will be the formation of ghost cells. Okay, so we know that these are the fat cells, okay, having the eccentric nucleus, and the other part of the cell is completely filled by the fat. Okay, but in this fat necrosis, the nucleus comes out of cell. Okay, so nucleus gets dissolved, due to which there will be the formation of these ghost cell. Okay, so ghost cells are anucleated cells. Okay, so this was all about the fat necrosis. Let's visualize the ghost cells through the diagram. Okay, so this is the diagram of ghost cells. You can clearly see there is no nucleus in this case. So now let's talk about the fibrinoid necrosis. This is the last special type of necrosis. Okay, so it mostly occurs in the vasculitis or malignant hypertension. Okay, what is happening in this case? Due to the injury to the blood vessels or inflammation. The blood vessels, okay, the endothelium of this blood vessels is injured, so due to which there will be the initiation of coagulation pathways. Due to the coagulation pathways, there will be the formation of fibrin. Okay, so this fibrin then gets deposited at the wall of these blood vessels. Alongside the fibrin, there will be the aggregation of some immune cells as well, thereby appears pink in color on microscopy. So this pattern of necrosis is known as fibrinoid necrosis, mostly seen in the vasculitis or malignant hypertension. You can clearly visualize those pink colored appearance on the microscopic diagram. Okay, so you can clearly visualize it. There is a circular pink pattern. Okay, so it was all about the necrosis. In this topic, we discussed the definition of necrosis, the patterns of necrosis primarily, which are the coagulative and liquefactive. We also discussed the special types of necrosis, which include the caseous, gangrene, fat necrosis, and the fibrinoid necrosis, alongside the examples and diagrams.